Well, good morning. Welcome back to Bedrock Church, Franklin County. Good morning, Ross.
Morning.
Hanging out here. I love the scenery today. We're going to be talking about some Egypt here in just a minute. So obviously a river, though this is probably not quite.
Yes, this is the Creek of Wade Park.
Not quite the Nile. Technically, this is Pig River, though. So this is our giant river, one of our giant river systems in Franklin County. We're glad you're here with us this morning. So Ross, we've been talking about this idea of uncommon sense, and we've been talking about uncommon things, and so I kind of last minute asked you to come up with something uncommon that you could think of. And so what do you have for us this morning?
Yeah, so thinking about something that we take for granted, that's just like assumed everybody would know or have, and what I thought of is the ability to read.
Okay.
That really through most of the world in ancient history, all around the world, it was not an accepted idea that people could read. It was like, up to maybe 5 people in the entire country, scribes and religious officials that would be close to the king, that would be able to read. Even like the kings and politicians didn't know how to read, just wasn't considered necessary.
Yeah.
Up until like the Middle Ages, people just didn't know how to read.
Yeah, even within the church history, like that's a big part of the Reformation and things that happened was because the people weren't able to read the scriptures for themselves, and so they were relying on other people, and that kind of caused the whole issue there. And so
now it's just a shock when someone says they don't know how to read.
Right. Yeah, it's just kind of a taken for granted. Now, I guess we have to decipher between reading what we call English and then like text language today, right? Because that's kind of where we are.
We've kind of gone back to hieroglyphics.
We really have. That's funny. Emojis and whatever you want to call it. Yeah. So the last time then I guess we left, we were looking through the life of this guy named Joseph, and kind of tracing through his story, kind of raised up as the favored prominent son of his father. And then, of course, that caused quite a bit of jealousy between his brothers. They didn't like it, so they essentially beat him up, threw him in a pit, and then sold him to some traders, right? And I think where we left off the last time was these traders took Joseph down to Egypt, and that's kind of where we left off. And so I think it would be helpful for us this morning, Ross, if you, I know with your background in history and studying a lot of this, could just fill us in on a little bit of the lifestyle and what it would have been like for a slave now, as Joseph was, for someone coming into this land of Egypt, because it was very different from where he was coming from.
Yeah, this is going to be hard for me to condense because I love talking about Egypt. It's super fascinating, but I think when we look at Joseph's story, there are only 3 aspects we really have to know to get the picture of what he's going through in Egypt. So those 3 things would be the role of agriculture in Egypt. We think about the fact that later in the story, Joseph and Joseph's family comes to Egypt looking for food. That's right. Mm-hmm. So that's a big piece of it. Yep. The idea of slavery, that Joseph sold into slavery. So that's an important aspect to talk about. And then the role of Pharaoh, where Joseph's going to interpret his dreams. So we need to understand who Pharaoh is. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on: agriculture, slavery, and Pharaoh. There's so much more we could talk about, but that's really what's relevant.
All right, so let's start with agriculture then.
Yeah, so when we think of Egypt, I don't know what you guys picture or what you think about. You think of Egypt, most often we think of like sand and just desert, but that's not the picture of the Egypt that Joseph would have walked into. The area that they lived in probably would have been similar to what's around us right now, this lush green land all around the river, specifically the Nile River. And the advantage of the Nile River is that it floods consistently. There's a wet season and a dry season. It always floods, and it produces this rich soil that's black and good for farming called silt. And so they would have an abundance of crops, and it's the area that Joseph would have walked into.
So that was almost as good as the red clay we have here in Franklin County, though, right?
A little bit better than that.
All right.
Yeah, so some of the things they would produce are things, again, you maybe wouldn't think of with Egypt. Things like melons and pomegranates and onions and sesame and castor oil. And then papyrus, of course, for them making their paper, and flax for making linens and clothing. But probably the most important crops of Egypt are barley and then an ancient form of wheat called emmer. And so Egypt is the origin of bread and beer. Not so much wine. That's more of a Mediterranean thing where the grapevines would grow. But beer and bread were the 2 inventions of Egypt before anybody else. And so when we get to the story of Joseph, it would make sense that the 2 people that would be important would be the cupbearer and the baker, because of bread and beer, the 2 major staples of Egypt coming into it.
And of course, toward the end of the story, as they're stockpiling up the goods, bread,
Right, the
wheat,
wheat,
plays
yeah.
a huge role in that.
Right.
Okay. So agriculture was a big part of this culture. And then you said we also need to know about slavery.
Yeah, so we see that Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. That's not particularly uncommon. All cultures in the ancient world had slavery. And it was based on whether you were a prisoner of war or someone who couldn't pay your debts. And so you voluntarily went into slavery to pay off a debt. And so when the Israelites brought Joseph, the Egyptians were not surprised that he was a slave. They probably assumed he was a prisoner of war or someone who couldn't pay a debt.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, I don't know, maybe with Joseph and his brothers throwing him into the pit, kind of a prisoner of war.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, against his will for sure.
Yeah. But in some sense, the lives of Egyptian slaves were a little different than what we'd think about with Rome or Greece or some of these other places, in that the status of slaves wasn't necessarily looked down upon. You'd have people working in the field who were slave and free, treated equally in a sense. There wasn't this stigma against being a slave.
So it was a little bit more like what we would say a working class today.
Right,
maybe,
yeah. It was just like a level
status-wise.
of poverty. Like you were someone who couldn't pay a debt, so now you're a slave, and it's
Right,
just your status of life.
Okay.
And in fact, slaves really ingratiated themselves in Egyptian culture. It was common for them to take Egyptian names, marry Egyptian women. They could own land. They learned the Egyptian language. We're very much just ingratiated. That's kind of what we see with Joseph.
Yeah,
right?
like we're gonna see in a little bit in a couple chapters that he name changed, takes an Egyptian wife. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, he just kind of joins in the system.
Yep.
And then the third thing we have to talk about with Egypt is the role of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. By the time Joseph arrived in Egypt, Egypt is already a superpower. And it's one of the most fascinating things about this culture is they are really a superpower for a long time.
Yeah, I think we forget that. Like, I think we just think like, oh, there's the story of Moses and like Egypt, but we don't realize that they were a big player for a long time.
Yeah. So Egypt is around starting in 2700 BC. So we are now in 2020 AD. So that's over 4,000 years ago. This is when Egypt starts as a civilization under King Menes. And that's considered the Old Kingdom. So even within Egyptian history, we have to divide it into Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. We're talking from 2700 BC until 44 AD. So it's a long time period.
Wow, yeah.
And so by the time Joseph gets there, it's about the 12th dynasty. So there have been 12 reigns of kings and families. And considered the Middle Kingdom. So the first pyramids and pharaohs have already been there for 1,000 years by the time Joseph gets there. So he would have seen the pyramids of Giza and these pyramids that.
So this system is well into place by the time Joseph enters into it.
Yeah, and they have their whole system of Egyptian gods and hieroglyphics and all their beliefs already set up for 1,000 years or so.
Okay.
Yeah. So what's important, though, about the 12th dynasty, and the reason it makes such a difference that Joseph is there at this specific time, is that this time the pharaohs have been overthrown and taken over by a group called the Hyksos, which were foreigners. So it would have been more acceptable for them to incorporate foreigners in their government system and allowed a Jewish boy to rise in ranks within their system. Versus the pharaohs were very ethnocentric, and you have to be Egyptian. Bloodlines were super important. This group that happens to take over at this time, we see God's providence.
Yeah, it really opens the door for Joseph to come in and for God to raise him up, which is what we're going to see here in the next few chapters.
And it's part of why we learn history is because of that. It's when the Hyksos are kicked out, is when the next pharaoh comes in, Ahmose the First, and he's the one that decides that no foreigner shall ever be allowed to take power in Egypt, which is when we begin the Exodus story. Okay. And so it's kind of that reaction to having these foreigners on the throne that causes him to want to limit the power of the Hebrews to rise in status, getting rid of the babies at the beginning of Exodus.
Okay.
And so there's a historical reaction that's happening here. But what we see with Pharaoh, why he's so important, is he's seen as a god on earth, that he is the human manifestation of Amun-Ra, the sun god, and that his job is to keep order. This word that they use is ma'at, this bubble that the Pharaoh controls. And in fact, that when hieroglyphics, cheats for hieroglyphics, when you see a name, something circled, that's the name of the Pharaoh, that he is in the bubble, keeping order in the earth that way. And we see that in just how they make things. If you look at the statues in Karnak, it's these statues of these rams, which is the symbol of Amun-Ra, and it's this huge walkway with those statues, and there's a little statue of a pharaoh underneath the chin of every one of those rams on this walkway, symbolizing that he is connected to Amun-Ra, but also under the authority of the god. The title Potiphar that we end up seeing, which is the guy that Joseph works for, is a title that means the second in command, and it literally translates as one who is placed on earth by Ra. So the sun god has given him authority through Pharaoh.
Okay.
So Pharaoh keeps this order, this ma'at, through violence and brutality, and that if you don't listen to Pharaoh, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be executed, and he can't intercede for the gods on your behalf and make sure the Nile is flooding consistently and the crops are growing and your way of life is sustained. And so Pharaoh wants the people to know who he is and see his authority, and they do that by constantly carving things on walls and building these huge statues that are 40 feet high of the picture of Pharaoh, so everybody knows exactly who's in charge, and tells the stories of their gods, of the different mythology, and how the Pharaoh is connected and one of these gods. And so we think of Egypt, we think of those things, of building the pyramids, these big temples
pictures,
or funeral homes for the gods, and these amazing statues, and so many hieroglyphics telling the stories of these things. But the story of Egypt is a story written in stone and created through brutality. And so when we think of Egypt, it's really this dual picture of the beauty of life with the Nile and all the things they can make and grow, but also a contrast of this darkness and brutality of Pharaoh, forcing people to learn a certain story through violence and through writing it in stone that's going to last thousands of years.
Yeah.
And we see with God's story a very different way of people hearing about who he is and his authority in creating order in the world. So we want to spend some time thinking about this and processing the difference between these two stories. So in your breakout groups, we're going to read a passage and talk about this. So read Hebrews 8, 10 to 11, and think about this. How does God's plan to bring order from chaos differ from Egypt and Pharaoh's plan? And where does God ultimately write his story for the world to see?
Yeah, that's awesome. Take a couple minutes, say good morning to the people in your breakout groups. Say something that you're grateful for this morning, and then jump into this discussion question, and then we'll be back in a few minutes to start on the next part of the story of Joseph. Welcome back. We are going to jump into the story of Joseph today. If you have your Bibles handy, if you have them with you, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 39. We're going to be looking at this whole story and this whole account in Joseph's life. And Ross, I feel like one of the things we can do sometimes is when we're very familiar with the passage, this is a passage that probably for a lot of us we've heard many times in church that we kind of familiar with. I think what we can do sometimes is we can jump into that with a mindset or a way of thinking and miss some of the other important things. Scripture is so rich and so full that sometimes we can just kind of always read the same passage and always get the same things out of it. But it's helpful when we go back and we also look at some of the other pieces in Scripture, because there are so many aspects to these stories, especially when you're talking Old Testament narrative stories. There's just so many things that we can glean from those. And I think that's true in this story as well. I think for most of us, when we read this story in our minds, we go to that moment with Joseph and Potiphar's wife, which is certainly a major part of the story. But we also miss, I think, some of the other bigger things in here. And so as we were talking this week, one of the things that you had mentioned here in this passage, in this chapter specifically, was this question that comes to mind. Are you the message or are you the messenger? And I think a lot of times what we can do is we can think that, man, I'm just the messenger of God. I'm just supposed to go out and share a message that God has for the world. And we certainly see that in the prophets and in other places. But one of the really cool things that we see in Joseph's life was he actually was the message.
Yeah, there's no other Bible, there's no other Jewish person they're going to see who Yahweh is.
And there's you get one little piece of dialogue in here where Joseph actually it's recorded what Joseph says, but predominantly it's through observation of his life and the way that he lived. And that's really what we want to look at today as we look at this uncommon idea, what it means to be uncommon. I think the very common response, especially in the church, in the Christian circles, a lot of times is that we are the messenger. We have a message to bring to people, and we just want them to hear our message. And that's absolutely true, and we absolutely need to share that message with people. But also to realize, as we see in Joseph's life, we are that message too.
That's that Hebrews passage that we just read, that God writes his laws on our hearts, and when people are to look at us, they're to see who he is.
Yeah, and even going all the way back, if we go back to the very beginning in Genesis 1 and 2, God created humanity to be image bearers, to be that message to the rest of creation. And then we fast forward the story to Genesis 12, and we look at Abraham and the promise that God gave to him. And it was a promise for him to be a great nation, not just for his own sake, but ultimately to be a blessing to the world, to show God to the world, to be God's people. And so as we get to chapter 39, now Joseph is becoming this message in a foreign land through his life.
Yeah. In a way, he's the first missionary, like before that was really a thing.
Yeah, and kind of against his own choice. But God put him in this situation, and he starts to share this God, this Yahweh, to this foreign group of people.
It's kind of crazy that we see already, like, the bigger picture, that Joseph is this type of Christ figure, like going to the foreign nations already so early on in the story.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. You certainly see the picture of God's heart, not just for his people, but for the whole world. And one of the questions we just want to be thinking about today, specifically about that, is not only what is the message. We know that the message is the fact that God loves us in this crazy way. He loves humanity, and that he pursued humanity, provided a way for humanity back to him, right? But the question we want to focus around today is, how do we share our message? Especially thinking about, if we are the message, how do we share that in our lives? And we're going to see there are two ways that Joseph does that. First and foremost, as we begin this story, we're going to see that Joseph shares his message by remaining faithful no matter the circumstances. And what's really cool about this chapter, Ross, I love how the author wrote this together, because you get two places, the beginning and the end of the story. You get two pictures of Joseph remaining faithful when circumstances don't turn out the way he's expecting them or thinking that they do.
Yeah.
Ross, will you read for us verses 1 through 6? We're going to look at that first picture of how things start to change in Joseph's life.
All right, so Genesis 39, 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessings of the Lord was on all that he had, in a house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate.
Okay. So he gets to this guy Potiphar's house, pretty important guy in the land who we just talked about, and when he gets there, it says that Potiphar noticed something about his life. There was something that the Lord had blessed him, even this God that Potiphar, I'm sure, didn't know, and through God's providence, Joseph is raised up to this prominent position. All right, so let's go ahead and just so we get a full picture of that. So some crazy things happen in the story. Potiphar's wife essentially tries to get Joseph to come to bed with her. He refuses. She makes these accusations, and then as we look at verse 20 through 23, we see that Joseph ends up in a pretty awful situation. So we read 20 through 23 for us.
Yeah. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
Yeah, so we get this picture kind of sandwiched in here in this chapter that Joseph remain faithful. That's kind of what we're looking at first and foremost today, is that Joseph remained faithful no matter the circumstances. So we see this moment where, okay, he comes in as a slave, and God raises him up to prominence, and then this awful thing happens to him that he did nothing wrong, but is accused of this thing, and then he gets thrown in jail, but yet we see that God is with him, and through all of that, Joseph remains faithful. And I think that's pretty important for us to think about. That's a very important concept, and I think even just as we think about our culture today, faithfulness is not, remaining faithful is not a concept we're super familiar with. We don't see a lot of great examples of that in our world today, whether it be through marriage covenants that are broken, whether it's through friendships, even in the church. There's this very common thing of people just kind of hopping from church to church to church, just trying to find something that they want, that fits their needs, and this idea of like remaining faithful, we don't see that a whole lot, but it's something that's very near and dear to us, and as followers of Jesus, it's something that we should characterize our life, and it's certainly something we see in the life of Joseph. Joseph remained faithful whether he was in prominence in Potiphar's house as he kind of became this high-ranking official, or whether he was in prison. He still remained faithful. You know, you think about Joseph's life, and man, he would have been justified to just had this kind of woe is me attitude. You know, he would have been justified. You think about it, he went from privilege in his father's house to the pit that his brothers threw him into, to now becoming a slave in this guy's Potiphar's house. But yet, as we pick up the story, there's no place where it seemed like Joseph, was resisting anything. I mean, it said that Potiphar saw favor, that he had favor with Potiphar, and I think that's because Joseph continued to remain faithful, even though his circumstances didn't turn out the way that he wanted to. It goes back to our bedrock principle we've been talking about, this idea of trusting God when life doesn't make sense, and we see that in Joseph's life, and so he continues to remain faithful. And ultimately, through him remaining faithful, this message then gets to Potiphar, this official, this guy who I would assume was a worshiper of all of the gods of Egypt.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting when you look at verse 3 here. It says that his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that he caused everything that he did to have success.
I think that's the success. I mean, whether you're in prison or you're in prominence, if you're being the message,
right,
you're being successful. I think that's an interesting phrasing with that verse too, that it's like Joseph was successful because he, like, that. Let me just read the verse. The master saw that the Lord was with him. Like, that's the success.
Right.
And then the other stuff is just extra.
Right. Yeah, that was the means through which this message got delivered. And it's pretty interesting. You know, you think about Joseph and just coming into the situation where he's coming in as a slave, but yet all throughout this story, you see that Joseph continues to trust God, and God blesses Joseph's life. But all of those blessings end up just pointing back to God. And I love that picture, that Joseph's faithfulness just continues to paint this message or share this message. I think the other thing we need to realize is that Joseph's faithfulness was grown over time. Like it wasn't just that he was faithful for a day or a week. Joseph, we find out Joseph in Genesis 37, he was 17 when his brothers sold him into slavery. He's 30 when he's promoted by Pharaoh. He spent 2 years in prison before his promotion. And so he was in Potiphar's house for about 11 years, something like that. And so when you think about that, you know, a lot of times we just think, man, if I'm just faithful, then you know, God's going to bless my life. He's going to do this thing for me. And then we're faithful and we do it. And then we do it for like a very short amount of time. And then we get discouraged or we just give up because it doesn't turn out the way we want it to in that moment. And I think Joseph's life is just this testimony of remaining faithful, no matter what the time is, no matter how long it takes. Continue to remain faithful and trust God, and God is ultimately going to be working in that. It reminds me of the old saying of how does it go? Somebody said, you can grow a squash overnight. You can plant a squash seed; it pretty much grows overnight. But an oak tree, takes years and years and years to grow. And it's like, what do you want to be in your life? Do you want to be a squash or an oak tree? And then, I was thinking about that a little bit further, and I was studying this week a little bit about the redwood trees. Mm-hmm. These great, huge, tallest trees in the world. I think the tallest one is like over 370 some feet tall, over 40 stories for most of these trees. What's interesting though, and what studies have seen, is that the oldest trees, the ones that are the oldest and the biggest, are typically the ones that grow the slowest. There's something about just taking that time to develop the roots and for them to grow at a very slow rate that produces this long-lasting effect on these trees. And I think sometimes God allows us to remain in these situations, these circumstances sometimes, to really grow our faith.
Yeah. We see that even like in God's plan for redemption. It's not like Adam and Eve sin and then immediately they're saved. It's a generational process.
Absolutely. And so Joseph just continues to remain faithful. But yet what I love in this story, if you go and just read through this whole passage, there's like 4 or 5 times in here that the author writes in here, he wants us to know that the Lord was with Joseph. Even in the midst of all of the remaining faithful, and in the midst of all of the circumstances and the craziness that Joseph went through, God was still with Joseph. And I think that's a message that probably a lot of us need to hear today, is that, we may be going through a circumstance or a season, something that we're not comfortable with, that we don't like, but to be reminded that even in the midst of that God is still with us is so important. It's so important in us being able to remain faithful throughout what God has called us to do. And so one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves then is, where in our lives does God want us to remain faithful? What is it that he's called us to? What circumstances are we in that he's just saying, you know what? I just want you to remain faithful in the midst of this. I don't give up. Don't give in. Continue to trust me. Continue to rely on my strength. And I'm going to be with you in the midst of that. So that's where we want us to start thinking about. But we also want to have some discussion. And so as we go out into our breakout groups for this next time of discussion, here's the question we want you to talk about. What do you think was Joseph's greatest challenge to remaining faithful to God? Joseph went through a lot. You think about being a slave. You think about, we're going to talk about here in just a minute, but we think about this false accusation that landed him in prison, and yet he still remained faithful. What do you think was the greatest challenge for Joseph? And then for you, what maybe is your greatest challenge to remaining faithful, to trusting God, even when the circumstances don't go the way you expect them to? So talk about that, and we will be back together in just a few minutes. Well, now we're going to continue to look into the story of Joseph. And we're going to look, again, at what his life looked like as the message. So we said that the first thing that Joseph did was he remained faithful. That was the first part of him being the message. But now we're also going to see that he was also the message by refusing sin no matter what the temptation was. And so, Ross, will you just read the story for us? We'll start in about verse 6 and go down through about verse 12 in Genesis 39.
Yep. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, talking about Potiphar. Mm-hmm. Because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house.
Okay. So there's this moment that, which was really not a moment, it was a culmination of moments, right? We see that
over this 11-year
over this period, and we see that Joseph, the author wants us to know Joseph was a good-looking guy. And Potiphar's wife noticed that, and it said that the day after day she cast her eyes on him, and she continued to entice him day after day after day after day. But I love what it says in verse 8. It says, "But he refused." He refused. And no matter what the temptation was, Joseph refused that. And Joseph refused sin even when it would have been easy or advantageous for him to give in. You know, it would have been easy because it says no one was in the house. No one
Right.
would have probably been there. It would have been to his advantage. I mean, if you think about it, Joseph would have, he would have thought, if I resist her, I could be in big trouble, which is ultimately what happens in the story. He could have also said, I'm not the one initiating this sin. I'm just a slave. She's in charge of me technically because I work for them. He could have found 1,000 excuses. Nobody's around. No one will ever know what took place. I'm sure it was very flattering, could have been very flattering for him that a prominent woman would have tried to get his attention in that way. But yet we see no matter what the temptation was, Joseph continued to refuse sin and not to allow that into his life. And I think that's key. I heard it said one time that temptation is a lot like a telemarketer. It comes back to us. It keeps coming back to us even when it's the least convenient time. It comes back again and again. It keeps pushing even after you say no. It makes what it's selling sounds great, but there's always a catch. And I don't know about you, but I have these people, this mortgage company that just keeps calling me over and over, and I keep telling them like we're not interested, but they just don't stop. And I think that's the same way sometimes with temptation, is that temptation in our life is not satisfied until we give into it. Right. And we see that Joseph was not going to give into the sin, into this temptation. Joseph's refusal of sin was also his message. Again, his action to refuse the sin was ultimately the message that he was speaking.
Because otherwise his words wouldn't have meant anything.
Exactly.
You could say, I'm not going to, but it's the actions that speak louder.
Exactly. And so he continues to trust God. There would have been every excuse for him to engage in this, but he doesn't. And I love what it says in verse 8 and verse 9. But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of my master has no concern about any of these things over my house. He has put everything in my charge, and he is not greater than in this house. No one's greater in this house of anything except for me." And he says, and he hasn't kept anything back from me except for his wife. He said, "How could I do this wicked thing?" And then he points it back not only to his master, but also to God.
When you were reading that, it really made me think of like the Garden of Eden. It almost is the same verbiage of like, as God, I've given you everything except for this one thing.
Right.
We see that almost like with Potiphar and Joseph.
We see how temptation and sin is luring, and it's the same old way, just kind of cast in a different atmosphere, in a different situation.
Yeah. It's again points to temptation. That like typology of Joseph as a Christ figure, of like he says the right thing versus Adam and Eve, where it's like
where they give in. Yeah, they give in to this moment. And I love it because not only does he realize that it would have broken his master's trust, but he also realizes that ultimately this temptation would have been a sin against God. And so Joseph's message was not was not to give in to the sin. And you think about this story, and Joseph's message of his life was received by 2 out of the 3 people that he shared it with. Potiphar initially saw God working in his life. We see the jailer saw that, but Potiphar's wife did not receive that message. In fact, in the story, she goes on to make an accusation against him because probably her feelings are hurt because he refused her. Goes on to make this accusation against him. And I think that's important to realize too, is that sometimes when we refuse sin, that people are going to make accusations, not receive the message that we're trying to deliver, even in our life. They're going to think, man, that person's just trying to be a goody-goody two-shoes, or they're trying to be this or that. They think they're better than me, whatever it may be, and they may not receive the message. But yet there will be people in our lives when we remain faithful, we refuse sin in our life, that will receive that message, that will hear that message. And so Joseph's refusal, again, though, was tested over time. I think verse 10, it says that And she spoke to Joseph day after day, and he would not listen to her or lay beside her, or to be with her. It's just this constant day over day over day. And Joseph's victory it took a long season. Again, we talked about he was there for probably 11 years that he had to continue to say no and to fight this temptation. And it was not a one and done kind of thing, but it was over a lifetime. And I think this victory was probably a product of, in this moment where she traps him this one day, that victory was a moment of 11 years of saying no, of being faithful.
With temptation, we only remember the one time we mess up and not all the times that we've said no.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. And so Joseph, I think, just building this trust of trusting God over this temptation day after day. And yet ultimately, not even in this, God didn't leave Joseph alone. God was still with Joseph, even in the midst of this, even what came after that. And so we think about that in our lives. It's like, what temptations are we facing in our lives today? What is that thing? What is that sin that is luring us in day after day after day after day, right? So here's a question we want to talk about in our groups for just a few minutes. How do our little decisions every day of our life prepare us for the more dramatic temptations that we will face? Do we take steps to avoid sin, or do we flirt with sin? It's like, what are those small steps? What is that day-by-day temptation in our lives that we need to be saying no to over and over again? And then ultimately, what are the steps we need to take to avoid that temptation? So talk about that in your groups, and then we're going to come back and wrap this up together in just a few minutes. Well, as we finish looking at this story in the life of Joseph, and we've just talked about how Joseph was this message, and this message was seen both by him remaining faithful and also him refusing sin. Now's the part where we bring that home to our lives. What does that mean for us as followers of Jesus in 2020? What does that look like for us? We just read what it looked like for Joseph in Egypt to avoid this temptation to remain faithful. But what does it look like for us today? And we're in this series looking at uncommon things, and our uncommon response has to be something we have to keep in mind, that remaining and refusing may cost us something in the short term, but choosing not to will always cost us more. It's like in that moment, Joseph would have probably been self-justified to just give up and not to do anything with his life, just kind of wallow in his own pity at all the things that had happened to him. And that may have made him feel better in the moment, but the long-term picture, look at this beautiful way that God uses Joseph in his story. It may have seemed like the right thing or the easy thing for Joseph in that moment to give in to the temptation with Potiphar's wife. But yet it would have cost him this place of being this character in this story of God, of being the message that God wanted him to be. Joseph's choice cost him his freedom in the short term, but saved his soul and really his whole generation in Egypt. Like, really, this picture was so much bigger than just him. And I love that. And so I guess one of the questions that we want to ask in our, as we think about this, is what is the message that your life is speaking? I think sometimes we can kind of fall into this place, Ross, that we just live our lives and we don't really think about what message our lives is speaking to those that are watching. And sometimes we don't realize how many eyes are watching our lives. Yeah. If you're a Christ follower today and you've at all been open about that or shared that with people are looking at your life. And it could possibly be for a lot of us that we are the message, the only message maybe that they're going to hear is our lives. And how do we respond to moments? How do we trust God? How do we resist or refuse temptation in our life? And I just think about that, and I think about what message is my life to those that are far from God? What message is my life leading for them? But there's some really practical pieces that we want to get to as well in this application. And so we want to talk through this. So first we want to talk about how to respond to uncertain circumstances. How do you remain faithful? in those moments that, you know what, I don't understand. I don't understand why things are happening the way they are, or what's going on in my life. And I think to that we need to just be reminded to remain faithful, to trust God that He's with us. A couple places in passage of Scripture that are just so encouraging. Isaiah 41 verse 10. Will you read that for us, Ross?
Sure. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand.
Yeah. So in those moments where it's like, man, life just seems like it's just throwing us all of these things, and it's like I don't know what to do next, and I don't know that I can do it. To just be reminded that God is with us and that He loves us. Probably one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament is Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 17. Will you read that for us, Ross?
Sure. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by His love. He will exult over you with loud singing.
Yeah, I love that picture of like that God is with us in the midst. And you know what? You may not have the strength to endure that situation, but God certainly has the strength. It says that He is a mighty one who will save. And sometimes we just need to stop trying to do it in our own strength and trust that He's going to give us the strength and rely on His strength when things are circumstances are uncertain to us in our life, and we're trying to remain faithful. But also as we think about temptation in our life and how do we refuse sin and those temptations, specifically as Joseph had to in the arena of sexual sin or sexual immorality that is such a temptation in our world today. A couple places in Scripture that speak to that. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18. Will you read that for us, Ross?
Yeah. It says, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body.
Yeah, like I love that encouragement. Just flee from that. And that's what we see with Joseph, right?
Literally flees.
Like literally, she grabs him by the coat and he just like strips it off and just runs in his undergarments, just runs out away from that.
And we were joking earlier, he loses yet another coat. You know, the colored coat, and now this one.
Yeah, Joseph is not the guy to look at as far as what it means to take care of a jacket. But also 2 Timothy 2:22. Will you read that for us?
Yeah. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart.
So good. Flee these passions, these things that in the moment seem like they're going to be worth it, but yet end up leaving us empty and broken when they're done with us. And pursue the righteousness, love, peace with a pure heart.
And I think that's a great verse because it talks about having that clear boundary, like not, again, what you're saying before, like flirting with sin, but stepping 5 steps back.
Yes.
But also then replacing it with those positives of faith and love and peace. It's not enough just to not do something. You have to replace it with something.
And especially as we look at being the message, that it's not just about what we don't do, but it's also about what we're known for as well. Not just what we stand against, but what we're standing for. And so some practical suggestions then. And this is both in the arena of how do we remain faithful and also how do we refuse sin. I think first and foremost is to be aware of the situations where you're vulnerable. We just have to know ourselves, and we have to know that there are certain circumstances and situations we're going to be more vulnerable, whether that's in the realm of temptation and sin. And we have to realize that, you know what, I can't put myself in that situation. I can't be in that place around that guy, around that girl, because I know that that's going to be a temptation that's going to eventually overtake me. I can't be around people who are doing whatever that may be, because that's going to be a temptation that I'm going to be vulnerable. We need to look at our circumstances and know that. We need to realize that sometimes when we're just in an emotionally vulnerable spot, you know, if we have been through something and we're in an emotionally vulnerable spot, we need to be careful who we allow into our life in that place. And even as it remains, as we look at remaining faithful, we need to identify, you know, what am I going through? What emotions am I having in this moment that's going to impact my faithfulness, you know? And so we need to be aware of that. We also need to be aware of how temptation works. We need to commit to purity and developing a strategy to overcome those temptations. We need to commit to integrity. We need to have an upfront commitment like you were saying, we need to decide before we get to that moment how we're going to respond. We need to come up with a plan. We need to be focused on our responsibilities, on those things that we need to be doing. We need to live consciously in the presence of God. We need to call sin. We need to see it for what it is. We need to avoid those situations. And then when we get in there, just like Joseph, we need to flee from those situations as well. We also need to realize that when it comes to us being faithful and our circumstances, we need to see them for what they are. Most of the time, they're just momentary circumstances that we're going through in the greater picture of what God has called us to do. And then finally, I think this is most important, is that we need to be willing to pay the price for our convictions. Yeah. That's what we see for Joseph. He was willing to pay the price, even when it was going to cost him something, to remain faithful and to refuse sin. Yeah. And I think that's what it comes down for us. Are we willing to pay the price to remain true to those convictions that God has called us to do? And so how will you respond today? What sense do you have within you that to remain faithful today, to refuse sin? I would encourage you today to think through that as we sing this last song together. I would just encourage each one of us to think through, what are those areas in my life that I am vulnerable to temptation, that I'm vulnerable to not trusting God in that circumstance? And then am I willing to pay the price, whatever it's going to cost? Am I willing to pay that price? Yeah. As we think about that today, and as we conclude today, I just want to encourage us to think about that. And I also want to remind us one more time that in the midst of all of that, just like we saw in Joseph's story, that God is still with us. No matter what we're going through, what we're experiencing, God is still with us. And so, Ross, that's going to kind of wrap it up for us today. We're going to sing one more song together. Think about that last response that we just talked about. And then next week, we're going to continue to trace through Joseph's story. Yeah. So thank you guys for joining with us again. We love you guys. We're praying for you. We hope you guys have an incredible week, and we'll talk to you real soon. Bye. Bye.